Hello and welcome to The Signal, WorkplaceNL's health and safety podcast. WorkplaceNL is the Workers' Compensation Board in Newfoundland and Labrador, Canada. The focus is to promote safe and healthy workplaces, provide return-to-work programs, and offer compensation to injured workers and their dependents. This series of podcasts will provide you with the latest information on how workplaces can protect the health and safety of workers. Please enjoy the show.
Asbestos is a natural mineral made of fibers invisible to the naked eye. It is durable, fireproof, and resistant to heat and chemicals. It may cause long-term health effects, including asbestosis, lung cancer, and mesothelioma when workers are repeatedly exposed to airborne levels that are above the occupational exposure limits. Employers, contractors, and owners of buildings must make every effort to minimize exposure of workers and other building occupants to airborne asbestos fibers. I'm DeeAnne Feltham-Scott, Occupational Health and Safety Educational Consultant in Prevention Services at WorkplaceNL. Today I'm joined by Erin Jones, Industrial Hygienist in Prevention Services. Today, Erin and I will talk about working safely with asbestos. Welcome, Erin, to the show.
Hi, DeeAnne. Thanks for having me.
So let's begin with, what is asbestos? Can you give us an overview of what asbestos is?
Okay, yeah, sure, DeeAnne. Well, asbestos is a naturally occurring mineral. Mm-hmm. It comes in the form of very microscopic fibers, usually in veins in a mineral body. Yeah. There's several varieties of it. Here in our neck of the woods here, especially in Newfoundland, most common variety you'll encounter is chrysotile. Mm-hmm. Chrysotile is a white asbestos, and if you happen to look under a microscope at chrysotile asbestos, it's usually very, the physical characteristics of it would be very curly. Oftentimes they'll come in almost like a tuft, like a bundle. Mm-hmm. You can also get amazite, which is brown asbestos. Like say, under a microscope, they're more needle-like. There's also chrysotile, which is commonly known as blue asbestos. Very obvious blue tint to the fibers when it's in a product. And you also have some more rare varieties like anthophyllite, actinolite, and tremolite. You don't see them as a whole lot, but you might encounter them in a boiler material sometimes, or tremolite. You might find that in attic insulation that'll blow in insulation, things like that. But yeah, it's pretty much like you say, it is a naturally occurring thing. It's not like a man-made fiber or anything like that, right?
Is there one type that is more dangerous than another, or are they all equally as dangerous?
That's a really good question, DeeAnne. Like you say, if you do some studies, I'm sure you could find evidence to support some are more potent, more toxic once you breathe them in. However, you should always treat any form of asbestos as equally harmful, because they all are known carcinogens, right? Yeah. So exposure to any of them is potential to cause cancer down the road, right?
Right. What is the history of the use of asbestos?
Asbestos, I believe it started being mined in the mid to late 1800s. And then through the Industrial Revolution, particularly after the Second World War, it became, heavily commercialized. If you got a product, like a household appliance, any building materials like that from, say, let's just say 1948 up to even 1985, you almost got it's a good guarantee asbestos in the product, especially if it's particularly for heat resistance, durability, things like that is a good indicator, right?
Yeah. I would imagine that there's a lot of buildings in Newfoundland that would still contain asbestos.
Yeah, that's a good point, DeeAnne. Like you say, particularly here in Newfoundland, Labrador, we went through our own kind of, building up of our infrastructure during that time period too. So we do have a lot of old buildings. There was a lot of, military presence from, the Americans and stuff here in the province as well, and they built a lot of infrastructure during that time. Like you say, we still use that infrastructure, so there's a high potential for asbestos to be in any products in those buildings. And like you say, even residential, there's a lot of subdivisions, residential development in general during that time as well.
So why was it banned?
It was banned because over time, especially as workers entered retirement age, working with the material for so long, there was a lot of incidences of, like say, rear cancers and lung cancers and things like that, and they pretty much linked those occupational illnesses to asbestos use. They found, from studying autopsies, things like that, they found asbestos fibres in people's lungs and things like that. So they attributed those illnesses to the exposure to those fibres.
When was it banned? What was the date? The 70s, in the 70s, 80s?
That's a good question, DeeAnne. In 1980 in Canada, there was restrictions put on asbestos. So pretty much, there was restrictions on the import and export of asbestos and how it was handled. Once, you're working with a material with asbestos, but it wasn't outright banned. In 2018, the federal government put a partial ban in. So pretty much now commercial products, import and export of asbestos products is banned. However, there's some exceptions for certain industries, like say nuclear industry, like nuclear power generation, things like that, as well as the military. There's some applications there where there's extreme conditions, and asbestos is still probably, your best option. So I think they gave a partial exemption there, maybe till 2030, to find another suitable material. You can still get it in those areas.
What types of industries or jobs or workplaces would we expect to find asbestos?
Anything with demolition or restoration of buildings. So if you tear down old buildings or tear out a section of it and, in the future rebuild it, there's good potential there to be exposed to asbestos. That would be, like, say, the most obvious one, like directly tearing down walls, ripping out piping, things like that. However, there's other occupations too, like, say, automotive technicians or heavy-duty mechanics, working with any kind of friction material. So, like, say, a brake pad, clutch plates, things like that. Those all were known to have asbestos in them too, due to the high heat resistance of asbestos. There's excellent mineral to add to those applications. And even mining and quarrying, you can, like you say, it's a natural occurring mineral, so you could be just blasting out some rock trying to make some gravel. You never know, you might encounter asbestos vein in there. And workers, in heavy equipment or working around the quarry there or the mine can be exposed as well, right?
So is there any legislation that is specific to working with asbestos or asbestos abatement?
Yeah, there is, DeeAnne. In Newfoundland and Labrador, it's under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, and it's Section 11198. Pretty much that section of the safety regulations will outline everything there is to know about asbestos, like what classifies as a asbestos-containing material. It'll give you the percentage of asbestos before you got to use abatement procedures. It'll give you a different terminology. Things like PPE required, engineering controls, ambient air quality during removal, things like that. And also things like get into proper disposal techniques, medical surveillance, things like that, right? Pretty much anything you need to know to do it safely, you can find within that section of the Act, right?
Right. And you just mentioned medical surveillance. Would the requirements for medical surveillance be in that piece of legislation, or is that in another piece of legislation in the regulations?
That's a good question too, DeeAnne. I guess you could call it the regular Health and Safety Act. It does touch on medical surveillance there, but in 11198, it also touches on medical surveillance there as well. Mm-hmm. It doesn't get into specifics, and that's usually due to the nature of asbestos-related illnesses. So when someone gets an asbestos-related disease, it doesn't happen overnight. So usually it takes, upwards of 40 years of exposure before you even develop any symptoms. And unfortunately, by then, it's too late. The damage is done. But So with that in mind, when you're thinking about doing medical surveillance for asbestos, you want to really consult a physician.
Yeah.
And get their input on what's required. So let's say, for example, you're starting a new abatement project with your company. You got one worker you got hired on, has been working in the asbestos abatement industry 20 years. You got another worker there, this is their first abatement job. It's highly likely the worker with 20 years experience at it, there's more potential for that person to expose. So you might, just say for instance, you might want to, do an annual chest X-ray or something, I don't know. Whereas the worker who's just starting, you might want to get a initial medical surveillance done upon hire, and maybe every 5 years after, and more they work at it, tighten in on the medical surveillance, the duration or the interval, I should say, right. And that way you can catch anything as soon as possible, right?
So now that we're talking about medical surveillance, like you said, it can take up to 40 years before you, I guess, start seeing any signs and symptoms of any type of lung disease that's associated, I guess, with working with asbestos. How does asbestos affect your health?
That's a good question, DeeAnne. Pretty much with asbestos, let's just say you're in the office and the walls, there's asbestos in the drywall joint compound or something like that. It's perfectly safe there as long as it's not disturbed. Mm-hmm. So if someone went to, even hang a picture, they might drill a hole in the wall, put a nail in the wall. There's potential to, once you break that matrix that the asbestos is bonded in, there's potential for those fibres to become airborne. So, like you say, if you were removing that wall material without proper asbestos abatement techniques in place, those tiny fibres were really, really small in size, like 0.1 microns in size, very small. If you think of a human hair, for example, that could be 10 microns in size, so it's quite small. You wouldn't be able to see it in the air, right?
Yeah.
So if you breathe those fibres in over time, if you can picture down in the alveoli of your lungs, which is where oxygen and CO2 is transferred from your blood, those asbestos fibres will get in there. So it's pretty much like a microscopic rod of glass in there. And as you alluded to earlier, there's so many properties of asbestos, like it's indestructible, pretty much, things like that. Your body can't actually get rid of it. So pretty much you get exposed to asbestos once, it's there for life, right? So over, like we said, 40 years, you got a little shard of glass, in all those little pockets of your lungs just moving around. And that just tears and wears away at the tissue there, right? So you can get scar tissue build up and lead to other illnesses as well. And essentially what will happen is it'll reduce the ability for your lungs to transfer oxygen to your blood, right? And, eventually it will become fatal, right? It's very, very slow and unfortunate death.
So medical surveillance is a really important piece of controlling the exposure to asbestos that employers are required to follow according to the OSH legislation. What else can employers do to reduce the risk of workers being exposed to asbestos?
Yeah, well, as an employer, you want to do a risk assessment, just like you would with any other job task. So let's just say you had an office building, for example. You could start by asking, what year was this building built in? So let's say, hypothetically, the building was built in 1968. Very high potential of asbestos-containing products were used in that building. Then you can do things like, okay, well, has the building undergone any renovations, things like that? You can kind of determine whether, perhaps asbestos was removed in the past, things like that. However, given, like you say, the age, it would be prudent for the employer to do a hazardous material survey on the building. So pretty much you get like a third-party consultant come in. They'll take some samples of representative building materials throughout the property, and they'll give you an idea of the if there is asbestos, like say the quantity, the location, things like that. And that'll give the employer a good idea of, how to protect workers in those areas where asbestos is present, right? So that's very fundamental, first part of the process. If you do determine there's asbestos in your building, you got to have an asbestos management plan. So that's going to outline things like usually someone in the building will be assigned as asbestos coordinator. They're responsible for notifying all other building occupants where asbestos is. If there's going to be any work, they'll make necessary precautions then to have the staff remove, things like that. And then it's also going to give you details pertaining to, what types of asbestos abatement procedures to use, things like that.
Right.
So that would be what you want to have in place. And then, like you say, you want to look at the work people are doing too. Let's say you had a garage, you might want to consider, the technicians working on the brake pads and things like that. You want to make sure that your supply of brake pads is asbestos free. If someone come in with an old car, or not even an old car really, like you say, depending on the country of manufacturer, a modern car might still have asbestos brakes on it. Right. So, just because it's, a new product doesn't mean guaranteed there's no asbestos in it as well, right?
Yeah.
And similar, like on a marine vessel, you might get some gaskets, materials down the engine room, for example, could still have asbestos in it to this day, right?
Right. So, in occupational health and safety, we always talk about the hierarchy of controls and, starting at the top by, first of all, let's try to eliminate it and then go down through our engineering and our administrative controls. And when engineering and administrative controls aren't enough to protect the workers from exposure, then we need to kind of, I'm going to call it double up with the PPE. So using PPE properly according to the legislation and according to the CSA standards is really important as well. Offers another line of defense for the workers.
Yes, definitely, DeeAnne. Like you say, it's that's an excellent point to make. And we'll go back to your question earlier. In the regulations there, they'll outline what kind of PPE you need.
Yeah.
And there's also specific training for asbestos abatement that you have to have. That's regulated by the province. There's a 1-day course and a 3-day course. And depending on the amount of people you have working on site that are removing asbestos, that will determine how many 1-day and how many 3-day training courses that the workers need to have. Right.
So anyone who's listening now, and they are sort of wondering if they've been exposed to asbestos as part of their jobs or what they do, what should they do?
Yeah, that's a good question to raise, DeeAnne. Like you say, similar to any other incident at a workplace, let's say you had a slip, trip, and fall. First thing would be to report it to your employer as soon as you can, and that way you can put precautions in place to prevent it from ever happening again. So let's say, hypothetically, you're in an office space and someone drilled a hole in the wall or cut a big hole in the wall, and you're like, does that have asbestos in it? You should report that to the employer, stop work immediately, get it tested, and, go from there. And then, if it doesn't contain asbestos, well, that's great. If it does contain asbestos, well, okay. We need to get a professional in, a property restoration company in to do it proper. If you're concerned yourself that you got exposed to asbestos, like you say, as a best practice, through WorkplaceNL, you can file a report only kind of claim, and that pretty much will stay in the file with that employer, until they retire. So you'll have a record then of potential exposure, and if anything did happen down the road, like you say, you'll have a record of it on file. But just to point out too, one exposure to asbestos might not necessarily be fatal. Usually it takes a lifetime of continued excessive exposure. A lot of cases, with people like installing boiler insulation, could have like 40, 50% asbestos content in it. No respiratory protection, no skin protection, no engineering controls, things like that. Or people who actually mined it. So, they were in very contaminated areas, 50, 60 hours a week, So it's, like say, one exposure like that, is obviously concerning, but, it's probably, is not necessarily fatal for you in the long
The
run. Right?
probability and
Yeah.
the severity are not as high
Yeah.
as it would be if you were working in an industry or in a workplace where you were constantly being exposed without adequate protection.
Yes, yeah, and another good way to frame it up, depending on the contaminant you're exposed to, there's different levels of toxicity and things like that, and then it all factors down to dose. But a carcinogen, so like a cancer-causing agent, a lot of people are familiar with would be cigarette smoke. So if you picture yourself, walking through a park and you walk through a cloud of cigarette smoke, that cigarette smoke is probably not going to kill you. But now you smoke 20 cigarettes a day for 30 or 40 years, your chances are drastically increased, right? So similar to asbestos, but,
Absolutely.
You still want to take every precaution to avoid it, right?
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining me here today and talking to me and to us about how to work safely with asbestos.
No problem. Glad to be here.
Thank you for joining us today. Transcripts are available to use in your workplace to increase workers' knowledge in various occupational health and safety topics. Visit WorkplaceNL.ca for more information on the services we provide to workplaces. Feel free to share the signal on social media to improve workplace health and safety everywhere. Thank you, and have a safe and healthy day.